The Oklahoma Living Legends. The date is March 14th, 1970, and I'm visiting with Mr. James Leake, who is a pioneer resident of Chandler, Oklahoma, who came to the state of Oklahoma, or who was born in the territory of Oklahoma 1 year after the run. But from here on, I would like to have Mr. Leake tell us a little. Mr. Leake, I wonder if you could tell us a little about your parentage and background of your family.
Well, my father came from England with his parents when he was 6 weeks old in 1849, and they went north of St. Louis about 100 miles and settled at Jacksonville, where his father had a brother-in-law working at the Illinois State Insane Asylum, which was at Jacksonville, and he grew to manhood there. And in 1889, when old Oklahoma, as we call it, the part where Guthrie and Oklahoma City and quite a bit of the central part of the state was open to settlement, he came to Guthrie. He told me that he was on the third section of the Rock Island train coming from Arkansas City to Guthrie, and that he arrived there soon after noon. The country opened at 12 o'clock, I believe. That was the time that the guns were fired, opening it for the run. He got some town lots over there and settled, and either the next Sunday or the following Sunday, he and some more people who he had gotten acquainted with met and organized the First Methodist Church in Guthrie. He lived there then until the spring of 1891, and in January, I believe it was in January of that year, he went back to Illinois and married my mother and brought her to Guthrie with him. Well, then in the fall of 1891, during this time, well, all the time he was a resident of Guthrie, he worked. There was an enormous amount of work to be done there. Everything had to be done. And he worked there for different people, worked for, among others, he worked for a lawyer by the name of Morgan, who later became congressman from that district, and Dick T. Morgan. And at the opening of the Sac and Fox Indian Reservation over here, where we are now, he came out to Chandler. He had gotten acquainted with a surveyor who helped survey this country in 1876, and he had told my father that out east of Chandler, see, the Chandler town site was a county seat town, and it was platted and laid off by those surveyors. And he told my father that out east of Chandler there was a succession of small prairies that looked like they would make nice farms. And my dad headed for that. He rode a wagon to the boundary line out, well, it was a little this side of Wellston, I think. That wagon, he rode with a wagon that far, and then when the 12 o'clock came, he started on foot to Chandler, getting over to Chandler in the evenings, later long toward night, and he met a Methodist minister from Guthrie that had come over here, and the preacher had a couple of lots staked somewhere in the town side. So he and my father were good acquaintances, good friends, and the preacher said, "John, if you will go down and get us some water, we'll make coffee and eat a little bit, and you can stay all night here with me." See, it was warm weather. I don't suppose that it was very cold. Of course they had to stay outside, but it wasn't very cold. And he said that he went and bought a wash pan. There was a tin wagon, or a wagon that sold tinware from Guthrie over there, and he said that all that he had left to sell was some small wash pans, just tin wash pans, and he bought one, went down to the creek, scooped up a pan of water, and they went up and made coffee, and he stayed with the minister that night. And the next morning, he had a little pocket compass, and he started out east from the center of town, walking east. There were no roads, understand. There was Indian trails, that's all. And he started walking east, following this compass, and he found the northwest corner of a section. He didn't know what the section was, so he knew that that was the northeast quarter, and that the center of the section would be 160 rods due east. So he took his compass and stepped it, and found the center of the section. He said it was the southwest quarter of 14:4. He found the witness tree was still standing, and there was a rock there at the center of the section. He said he got the numbers, that it was 14:4, Township 12 or Section 12 and Township 14, Range 4, east of the Indian Meridian. And he said he arrived at the conclusion that this place was the southwest quarter of Section 12. He said there was a tent and a covered wagon already here. But he went back to Chandler, and the next morning caught a stage over to Guthrie. There was somebody hauling passengers. He went to Guthrie and got in line with at the land office to file. Well, he said that there was a long line, and every evening at closing time, they must have numbered them in the line so that they wouldn't lose their place. Anyway, he said that every evening they posted a list of all the filings that had been accepted that day. And when his turn at the window came, he had this lawyer with him. And he told the clerk at the window that he wanted to put a filing on the southwest quarter of 12:14:4. And the clerk says, "I can't let you file on that land." He said, "There's a soldier declaratory on it." And he said this lawyer spoke up and said, "Well, if you won't accept our filing today, we want it to become part of your records that we have applied for this filing at this hour of this day." He said the clerk looked at him a minute and said, "Wait." And he went back in one of the other offices, and he said in about 15 minutes he come back and said, "I'll take your filing." Well, he put his filing on, and then gathered, in the next day or two, he gathered the things that he would have to have. He bought a wagon and a team, and the things that a man necessarily had to have to survive in the wide open spaces. This was wide open, if you remember. And he came back over here, and the tent and the wagon was gone. He said he never did talk to them, but he found out afterwards that they were people who had used their filing rights in old Oklahoma, over in Logan County, and they didn't have any right to file. So that's the way he got his filing. Well, you had to stay with your place pretty close. You had to improve it. And he went back and forth to Guthrie, left my mother over there, and I was born the following December. And then the 12th of March in 1892, my father went back over there, and they loaded up the household goods. Went back in a wagon now, mind you, and they loaded up their household goods and moved out here to Chandler, out to the farm, here to the place. They called it a claim those days, and they were all day on the trip. See, it was about 40 miles, and you didn't have good roads. You just wound around among the stumps and the trees and the rocks and followed the trails. There wasn't any roads laid off at that time to amount to anything. And they got out here that evening late and established their home. He had a small cabin built, and he had a little barn for the team, little log barn. Everything those days nearly was done with logs. And he had built a small cabin for the house and chinked it up, and at least you could live. And times were extremely hard. There was very little money in the circulation, and there was It wasn't the things that we have today. You couldn't go to the grocery store and buy the things that you can today, and you couldn't buy anything on credit because the storekeeper, he had to have his money so he could buy more. You couldn't buy but very few things. I can remember when you go over to the store and you could buy salt bacon or salt pork. It wasn't bacon. It was. I don't suppose I saw a piece of what we call smoked bacon for several years. We used to cure, and we had hogs. We cured our own meat, and we lived pretty well off of our own resources. We always had milk and eggs, and Dad, after he got established a little bit, he raised wheat, and he took that to mill, and we had wheat and cornmeal for bread, and we raised our sweet potatoes and turnips and the things that was, and they came from Illinois. They just naturally hold that stuff up, you know. They put it away, and we lived on it. It might not have been exactly what we wanted, but we lived on it. And there was lots of game. You could kill squirrels and rabbits and coons and things like that. And at that time, there were lots of deer, but they didn't last very long. And times were extremely hard. All the transportation was by an old lumber wagon with a team over these rutty roads, as I say, dodge around the stumps. And a good deal of travel was done on horseback. The women and children didn't go to town then on Saturday afternoon like they do now, or whenever they got ready. If we went to town once a month, we was doing pretty well, and we were only 2 miles from town. It was the people today can't understand the extreme hardship that we had. But these people came to Oklahoma hunting homes. A great many of them came because they wanted a home. They wanted land. They wanted to get themselves established. And they brought their churches, and they brought their Bibles, and they organized the churches and the schools, and built the roads, and planted the orchards, and farmed the land, and fenced it, and made it what we have today. It's a far cry from what it used to be. It's our early schools. Our school down here, this neighborhood school here, was established early in 1891 or 2. I don't know exactly which. It was there before I was big enough to remember. And it wasn't but just a year or so until there was Sunday school organized there that we kept going for more than 70 years. It has been closed down for 4 or 5 years now. And our school was a one-room school. I went to school there. My mother had learned me to read and to write, and I knew considerable arithmetic, and I was a good-sized boy at 10 years old when we started to school. My sisters went with me, and the 3 of us started together. And we worked, our school then run 6 months in the winter, 5 months a lot of times, or 6 months. It was a varied somewhat with the weather. And afterward they got to raising cotton in here. This became a great cotton country for a while, for a long time. And we'd have 6 months school in the winter, and then we finally got to where we had 6 in the winter and 2 in the summer. We'd start in school about the 10th of July and finish up about the 1st of September. That allowed us to pick cotton from through September and October and November, and then we started over again. Well, we got our education such as it was. There's one thing about it, this country. These people who came in here, a lot of them, they were very self-reliant. They were inventive and ingenious, and they tried. They did the best they could. And I'll tell you one thing. If you had gone to my dad when I was 5 or 6 years old and said, "Now, Mr. Lake, you're having a hard time, and if you'll go over to town and sign up, you can get some free groceries. They'll help you a little bit." You know, that old man would have got up on his hind legs and he would have really told you off. He just said, "Well, now, We may not have as much as we like, but we got it, and what we got's our own. And he'd have bawled you out, and that'd have been the closing part of that. But nowadays, it's altogether different. I remember them talking in the early days here about some man who was a neighbor here, and one of them said, "Why, he can make a wagon tongue with his pocket knife." You had it to do. You couldn't go over town and get another one. You took your axe and went out and made it. And if you wanted to split posts, you took your axe and you went out and cut a tree down, a small tree down, and made you a maul. And then you cut some wooden wedges and you split posts with them. That was part of our work. And people today can't realize the extreme lack of the things that we had. But we did have, at that time, we had the self-reliant spirit. We had the willingness to do. They worshiped the Lord, and that was a great help to us. Of course, now we have the same problem to a certain extent. Then there were men who drank too much. There were sharpies and gamblers and things like that. But by and large, the country was populated with people who were God-fearing, and they visited. And if somebody had some hard luck, why, everybody pitched in and helped him. He didn't go on welfare just right now. He couldn't. There wasn't any such.
You know, you hear talk about the barn raisings and that sort of thing. Tell us about those.
Those kind of things. A lot of times the neighbors would gather in if a man was going to work had a barn raising, or if a man got sick. I've done that myself. I went, and if a man got sick or had some bad luck, had sickness or lost some of his family, why, the neighbors would, they'd go, and if his crop got behind, I've gone and took a team and go and work for a man in his crop, and we never didn't charge anything. No, we didn't want anything. Sometimes the women folks would bring their lunch, and we'd have dinner or lunch at noon, and we had companionship with each other. That is, we visited, and they were more congenial then than they are now, I think. We had time we don't seem to have time now. Our time we're involved in so many other things, I guess. But you know, I can't realize the time, the difference in the time. When folks came from Guthrie, undoubtedly my mother held me on her lap that whole day long, because I don't suppose there was any chance whatever to lay me on anything. And I can't help but wonder to what extent the young women of today how they would react to that kind of a thing. But it's been a great thing. We've seen the country go from wild, uncivilized country, or they're not uncivilized so much, but just wild, undeveloped. We've seen it developed, and it's become home to a lot of people, great numbers of us, and it's been a fine trip. It's developed a lot of standards. There's been a lot of nice men went from this community and grew up with us, and I think to quite an extent they've had a very great influence in a lot of fields. We've had a lot of hard times, sure, and we still have them, but then we're doing things we like to do, a lot of us, and that's a great thing in life.
Thinking in terms of your earliest years, say the first years you remember, what could you think of as 3 or 4 particular experiences that you have either witnessed or been a part of in your earliest years that might be worth telling about?
Well, I'll tell you about that. I remember very well the Chandler Cyclone. See, the place here is just 2 miles straight east of town. And at the time of the Chandler Cyclone, it was long in the evening.
What year?
I think it was in 1895, I believe. I believe it was in March of 1895. And I remember my father standing out west of the house. We lived down yonder. I remember my father standing out west of the house and watching that cloud. And he told my mother, he said, "Mama," he said, "there's an awful bad storm going over west of us." He said, "I believe it's right about Chandler. But," he said, "it's going to miss us, I think." He said, "It seems to me like it's moving north, and I don't believe it'll come this way." And in about 15 minutes, possibly a little bit over that time, there were some people by the name of Fletcher. J.C. Fletcher lived right north of us, about 40 rods. The Fletcher house was right about that distance from ours. And in a few minutes, there was one of the Hoyt boys. I don't know whether it was Fred or Ed. J.C. Fletcher had 2 daughters, he and Mrs. Fletcher, and they were good-sized girls, grown girls, and these Hoyt boys were courting those girls. So about 15 minutes after the storm seemed like it had passed Chandler, one of these Hoyt boys came out on a horse. He didn't have any saddle on it, and the horse's head was one side of his head was all battered. In fact, one of his eyes was knocked out. And this boy didn't have any hat on, he didn't have any coat. And he hollered and told my dad, he said, "Chandler's all blown away, and there's a lot of people killed over there." Well, he went on up north. He had come out to see how Fletchers were. And when he told Mrs. Fletcher and the girls that, they had a buggy, and they gathered up their linens, their tablecloths and sheets and napkins and all the linen they could, and got in the buggy and went on over to Chandler, and they worked that all through that night. There were 17 people killed in that storm. And my dad got on a horse as soon as the Hoyt boy told him. He caught a horse, saddled him up, and went on to town. And I judged at that time it was probably 4:30 or something in the evening, about this time of the year. And my dad stayed there all night. He didn't come back. He stayed all night. And I remember very distinctly the next morning, he was telling us about how terrible it was and how many people had been killed. And he told us in particular one thing that shocked us. There was one man trapped in some wreckage there that they couldn't get out. The people couldn't get him out. And the wreckage caught fire, or was on fire, and he burned to death in that wreckage. And my father said that he just begged somebody to get an axe and knock him in the head.
Yeah, sure.
I remember how that shocked us. He said that man's screams were terrible, but they couldn't do anything they couldn't get him out. And the next Sunday, I don't know, it was 2 or 3 days after that, Father took the wagon and took my mother and us. I think there were 2 of us. He took my oldest sister and I, and my mother and Dad. We took the wagon and went up through what was Chandler, where we could drive around the streets that had been laid off, and they were full of trash, debris of all kinds, buildings and everything. And I never will forget the extreme desolate and terrible condition that it was in. And now bear in mind, too, that at this time there wasn't any telephone connection. The only connection that we had was men went from Chandler on horseback to Cushing, and to Shawnee, and over to Sac and Fox Agency, and some of them went to Guthrie for help. They didn't have a telephone. That was before the railroad was built through here. There wasn't any Western Union or anything. And that sticks out in my memory very, very plain. Another thing that I remember in early life there, we didn't go to town on Saturday. Most generally, Father, if he didn't go in the lumber wagon, if he had a great deal of stuff to bring back, of course he went in the wagon. But if he didn't, he went horseback. And us kids, we stayed home pretty much the time. And one evening he came back from town and was telling us about some medicine peddler of some sort was there in town, and he had a rattlesnake that he was playing with and using it to attract attention. And Dad said that he was holding that snake up and had it by the head, close by its head, and said some man out in the crowd said, "Oh, that snake's had its fangs pulled out." Said it couldn't bite you if it wanted to. Dad said he took his lead pencil and held the snake's head and pried its mouth open and showed him. He said, "There's its snake fangs." Well, he fooled around with the snake and was feeling about what he was selling, and the thing bit him in the thumb, on the end of the thumb. And he said that somebody run to the saloon and got a lot of whiskey, and they got him to drink all the whiskey you could get down him, and then they took him up to a doctor. And by the time the doctor got to work on him or got him, he said that he wasn't suffering as much from the snake bite as he was from the amount of whiskey that he drank, and so he gave him an antidote for the whiskey. And between the snake bite and the antidote and the whiskey, why, he died that night. And he's buried out in that old Eckert Cemetery, out an old deserted cemetery about 3/4 of a mile southeast of Chandler. But we didn't see that, of course. But my dad was a witness to he said he saw the snake bite him. He fooling around and he got careless just an instant that thing bit him. They were in the early days here. They said there were a great number of rattlesnakes in the country, lots of them, but they didn't last very long. A rattlesnake, when you came close to him, he announced his presence. He warned you to stay away, and nearly everybody carried sidearms. They'd have a pistol or a gun handy, and that was the end of the snake generally. So they didn't last but 2 or 3 years. In all my life here, I've never killed a wild rattlesnake. I've never seen one here on the farm in all the years that I've been here. But they didn't last but just a little while. But anything else you want?
Well, let's talk about education a little bit. You told about the school. Why don't you tell a little bit about the process of learning in a one-room schoolhouse?
Well, our schoolhouse here, the first one was a log building. I guess it was about 16 feet square, 18 feet at the most. And it was built either in the winter of 91 and 2, about that time, I think. And it stood until 1898. I never went to the log schoolhouse, and in 1898, 3 acres of ground was donated by J.C. Fletcher right across the road from where the schoolhouse was for the building of a school, or of a schoolhouse. And they built in the spring of 1898, they built a new stone building. The walls were completely of stone, and that was where the community got the name of Stone. It was the Stone Community, and that building was replaced in 1911 by a frame building which was used until, I guess probably 8 or 10 years ago. And then it was sold. Our school attendance fell below the required number, but within, I think, after the first log building was built, I think probably within the first year or so, they started a Sunday school, and that continued until for more than 70 years. And we used to have Sunday school there in the afternoon so that they could have the Chandler preachers, the Methodist preacher, the Presbyterian preacher, the Christian preacher, and the Baptist minister. They all took turns one Sunday a month, and they would come out from town and preach in the afternoon. And that gave us a very great effect on the neighborhood. That was a neighborhood center. And our school teacher would, at some times here, there was an attendance, average daily attendance of around 70 pupils. And that, the one teacher, and there wasn't very much foolishness went on outside of lessons. Somebody was busy all the time nearly. We managed to get a fair education. I never went to high school any, pardon me, but we got a working knowledge of education as we went along, and it's been a tremendous influence on us. The education and the religious background. It's still. I'm satisfied that its influence will go on for untold years yet.
Tell about the social life in your early.
Well, there wasn't a great deal of social life. That is, people were very much more friendly then than they are now. It was a very common thing to visit neighbors within a mile or two, a couple of miles. There was more people living in the country then than there is now. That is, every farm had one or two families on it, one anyway. And there was a great deal of visiting went on, and they met each other very often. It wasn't unbearable by any means. I can remember very well when our first telephone lines were built in here, and that, of course, that broadened our contacts out a whole lot. And we always had a paper, a weekly paper. The folks got one from their home back in Illinois. That always came every week. We took the Guthrie State Capitol, and that came every week. And we always took the Chandler paper. So we learned a good deal, kept up with things. Of course, things were a lot slower then than they are now. If you went anywhere, you went on the train or you drove a car or drove a team. You didn't have a car and go here and there and yonder. You drove a team if you went overland or rode a horseback. It was altogether different. You just can't imagine the difference.
Can you think of any other events? You mentioned the tornado. You mentioned the school. Can you think of any other events that you feel are important in your early life, say prior to 1900, that might be worth mentioning?
I don't. Our family was very fortunate. We didn't have any breaks in the family circle until way up in 1927. We were that lucky. And we didn't have any breaks until that time, but I didn't have that to concern with.
Talking about the tornado, tell about the rebuilding of Chandler following the tornado.
Well, the rebuilding of Chandler, there was a great deal of, there was only a few buildings left standing in the entire town, and there was an enormous amount of work went on after that, It had, all that stuff had rebuilt, and all of it had to be freighted from Guthrie or Shawnee or Cushing. There was no railroad connection here then. The railroad wasn't built till some time after that. And that, of course, that brought in, when the railroad come, well, then they shipped in things over the railroad. But I remember one instance, the folks talking about it. There was a man hauling lime, what we called stone lime at that time, from Shawnee. And it was in barrels. They packed that was just burned limestone that had been burned in a kiln, and it was still looked pretty much like rocks. They called it stone lime. And it would slack. It wasn't slack like we've got now, hydrated as we call it, but it was just stone lime, and it was in barrels. This man was coming from Shawnee, and if it got wet, that stuff would get extremely hot. Oh, it just, when you went to slack it, to use it for plaster or mortar, why, they slacked it in a tub, in a mortar box, and poured water on it, and it would get exceedingly hot. Oh, it generated an enormous amount of heat. This man had gone to Shawnee for a load of lime, and coming up south of Chandler ways, 4 or 5 miles, it come on an awful hard rain, and his wagon got stuck, and he just unhitched the team and he left his load of lime uncovered, and it came an extremely hard rain, and that lime started to slack and burnt the wagon, and when he went back the next day, all he had was the irons of his wagon. it burned his wagon and completely up. I remember the folks talking about it at that time. And I remember one other instance. There was a man, I don't recall his name. He lived up northeast of where we do, and he got a little money ahead, and he went to Cushing for some lumber. He was going to build something. He went to Cushing for some lumber, took his money with him, of course, and he got up there in Cushing and was going to stay all night. Well, he stayed all night at what they called a wagon yard. That's a place where you could put your team up and feed them, and you could sleep in the wagon if it was warm, and they fed and took care of his team. Well, he put his team and wagon up, and that night he got in with the wrong crowd, and some of them got him drunk, got his money, and the next morning early they got him up. He was sobered up enough, so they put him on, hitched his team up, and started him out back home. And he took off the box off the wagon and had what we call just the running gear, just the wheels and the coupling pole and the tongue, and he was sitting on the front of the wagon with his holding his lines and his feet dangling down, and it came up an awful sudden, very quick cold snap. And when he got home, he had his feet froze. And I remember the folks talking about how terrible it was that men would get him drunk and get his money, and then they started him back home. And I think he had a lot of trouble with his feet. That was my understanding of it at the time.
Who were the leaders in Chandler during those earlier days? What names can you think of who were leaders in the farming of the town?
Well, there's a lot of people. I don't know so much. There was a number of doctors came there, and old Dr. Wolcott was one doctor that came there in the very early days, and there was a man by the name of Hedrick was a doctor there, and we always had Dr. Wolcott. His daughters live there in Chandler now. They're a little bit older than I am. And A.D. Wright came in the opening there when the run was made. Wright came there and established Wright's drugstore, which is still in operation yet. However, it's under different management the last couple of years. But there was Dr. Wolcott and Dr. Harriman, and there was a man by the name of Wallace. Dr. Wallace, Bisbee and Wallace were in partnership, and here a year or so ago I met Dr. Wallace's son. He's with Liberty National in Oklahoma City. I met him down at Muskogee and visited with him a while. And there was, politically, there was J.B.A. Robertson, who later became governor. I believe he was district judge over here for quite a while. And there was old Bill Tillman, of course. He's well known as a lawman, and I went to school. His office deputy, later on taught school out here at our schoolhouse, and I went to school with him. And he was a man of great practical knowledge and ability, and a very conscientious man, and I learned more from, his name was Croom, William H. Croom, and I learned more from Mr. Croom than he was the basis of my education. He afterwards was county commissioner over at Okmulgee. But
what was the economy of Chandler during those early? What supported it economically during?
Well, the country here, I don't know. I guess it was probably the third, fourth year they began to raise cotton. I remember the first field of cotton I was in. It was over a little west of us here on what we called the Ashton place. And I went over there, and they called it Egyptian cotton. And it was way above my head, so I must have been very small. I guess it was probably 3 feet, 3.5 feet high. It was above my head. And the cotton did well, and the economy was built on cotton. This was an enormous cotton country for a long time, and in the fall, when they were picking cotton, I've taken cotton to the gin with a wagon and team, and you leave here and leave home, try to get there as early as possible, and lots of times you would be after night getting home. At one time there were 7 cotton gins in Chandler, and there was a cottonseed oil mill built there too. The first cotton gin I ever remember was a country gin out southeast of here, about 2 miles and a half, and my dad and I went down there. They had a grist mill in with it. That is, they ground corn and wheat, and we took some corn, I believe it was corn we took down there to get ground, and they were ginning cotton, and they carried that cotton up into I don't suppose they had more than 2 stands. I imagine about two gin stands. They carried that cotton up into that gin by hand in those wicker clothes baskets. They'd hold about, I judge, about 2 bushels maybe. They carried that in and fed it into the gin stands by hand. There was no suction at all, and the seed went out back to the back of the gin stand, and they had what to me seemed an enormous pile of cottonseed out there. And anybody that wanted cottonseed, they weren't no value. Anybody that wanted cottonseed could go and haul them off. And it would rain on that cottonseed piled out. If it got a rain on it, it'd get hot, or it'd just burn your hand inside. And there was no market for cottonseed at that time. That was prior to the time when the cotton oil mill came to Chandler. There was no market for it.
What was the first industry that came to Chandler?
Well, there was the vitrified brick plant was down there. They were, I'll tell you, if you came in on 66, they were right at the south edge of town there. There's a motel. They dug out that clay, and there's a motel built in there now. That's where they took the clay out. They had a runway went up over the road, and they worked on the north. They dug their clay on the north side of the road and went up to their plant. That was the Chandler Vitrified Brick Company, and that's where you get these Chandler OT brick. They say Chandler OT, that's Oklahoma Territory, and that is long before statehood. Well, in the first things that I can remember, in the real early days, there was a man by the name of Owens, D.R. Owens. He had a partner by the name of Jackman, and Owens and Jackman had a sawmill. Of course, there were several sawmills in this country at that time, because there was a lot of this early building was done with native lumber. It was done with oak lumber, and Jackman and Owens had this sawmill in Chandler, and then it wasn't too awfully long till when they got to growing cotton. Well, they went in and put in a cotton gin, and I was when we lived down to the north. Our house used to be north of where it is now. When we lived down there, I was just a very small boy, and there was a man came one day at noon or early in the morning, and said that they were hauling a steam boiler for D.R. Owens' cotton gin overland. They were hauling it on a wagon, and they would like to stay at our house at noon. He said they'd be right about here at noon. I think he was on horseback, and he told my dad that they would be at our house at noon, and they would like very much to water and feed their teams, and he said that if my mother would fix dinner, they would be very happy to pay her for it, and they did. I was a very small boy, and I thought that boiler was an enormous thing. They didn't I don't know where they had picked it up at. They had picked it up at the railhead. I don't know whether it was Sapulpa or where it was, but it was in east of us, and they were following the old Indian trail that came through, and that old Indian trail, they crossed, there was a little creek, Shuckahole, right out northeast of us here about a mile. They crossed that Shuckahole Creek, that trail did, and they come on wandering across here, and they were following that trail because, I don't know, it seemed to me like I was a small boy, of course, and things looked very large to me then. I guess my guess now is they had 8 or 10 teams pulling that boiler, and they were following that old Indian trail because there wasn't any bridges that would hold that kind of a load up, and they had to go. They had to follow the old Indian pre-settlement trails, and they came by, and to me that was it was a tremendous. My mother, she fixed lunch for them or dinner, and they fed and watered their teams. Of course, from our house they could get into Chandler because there wasn't any big bridges, or anything they could make it all right enough. But they came across the country, and I remember. You see the place here. Now, the old Indian Trail from Sac and Fox Agency on west to Fort Reno, and I undoubtedly connected with other trails, I guess, clear across the country. And the first stop on that trail, that Indian Trail from Sac and Fox, came through here it's about 20 rods south of the house here. They came in, and there was one come in, there was a junction here, and one trail come in. They followed the divide. See, we're on the divide between the Shuckahole Creek and Deep Fork, and they followed those divides because there wasn't any deep ditches. They couldn't cross a deep, sharp ditch. They had to go around it. It might be 10 miles, but they still had to go around. One branch crossed the Shuckahole Creek out here at what we called a Rocky Ford. It was a rocky bottom and low banks on each side, and you could drive across it, and you still can. And the other came from Sac and Fox Agency, and the first stop was a store that they called Wells Store. That was over. They tell me now that Wells Store was about a mile north of where the town of Wellston is now. But that trail crosses out here. You can see it down here by the west of the house. But I remember the Indians, they would go to Sac and Fox Agency for their quarterly payments. You see, they had a quarterly or quarterly headright payment, and they would go over to the government Indian office at Sac and Fox Agency, and at that time Sac and Fox was quite a nice place. They had wonderful Indian schools over there, and the government traders were Huffman, Charles, and Conklin. They were over there, and the Indian agent was over there, and they would go over there every 3 months to get their annuity or their payments, and they'd come back through the place here. And I remember my mother, she thought that it was terrible. She was from Illinois, and she was just dead set that they were afraid of Indians. She thought they'd tell them what they'd do. And if my dad wasn't around the house and there come a bunch of Indians, they'd be maybe, I would say now that they'd probably be 30 or 40, and they'd be on ponies, and they'd have blankets around them, and they'd have the kids tied on ponies too. And they'd nearly always stop right out west of the house here because there was good grass, and there was water if it was anything like a rainy time, there'd be water there, and they'd stop and let their horses eat. See, the country wasn't fenced up then at all, when I can remember. And they'd stop there, and my mother, if my dad wasn't here, she'd take us and go over to Fletcher's, north of us, and wait till those Indians went on. But they never would bother anything. My dad said when my oldest sister was born, it was about the time of the opening of the Cherokee Strip, and he said that all the money he had the day she was born, all the money he had was 30 cents. He said he sold some Indians 6 watermelons for 30 cents. The day before that, he said that's all the ready money he had. But we got by.
Can you think of any particular experiences with Indians that might be worth mentioning?
No, we never. I think there was a time or two when one would come down there to the house, but they never molested anybody. They never hurt us. There was never but one time that I remember in all our experiences here there was never but one time that I guessed we were in any danger whatever, and that was a bunch of drunken whites. Now the house was right east of here, right where this house is, and there were saloons then, and there was a bunch of drunks down in southeast of here they lived down close to Sparks, and they'd go to town on Saturday, and they would stay in the saloons till the saloons closed a Saturday night, and then they'd get on their horses and they'd come out this way going home, and they'd be shooting along and hollering and shooting and yelling. And I remember one night in particular, we could hear them way up on the hill there shooting, you know, and I don't know whether I don't think there'd ever been any friction between Dad and any of them or not, but not that I know of. Anyway, of course they were drunk or half drunk, and he heard them shooting and hollering up on the hill there before they got down here, and he told me he had an old 10-gauge double-barreled shotgun. It had a great long barrel, and he always kept a few buckshot cartridges. He loaded his own shells, and I'd put a half a handful of buckshot in each cartridge, and that night he always kept those things handy, you know. And that night he heard those fellows shooting and hollering as they come down, and he told my mother, he said, "You and the kids stay in the house." And he blew the light out, and he come out, must have been undoubtedly it was moonlight, because he come out and he stood in the shadow of the house, and they were right down there in the field, just probably not over 100 yards from the house. They stopped, and they hollered and yelled and told him to come on out. They wanted to fight. Come on out. And he called back and told him, he said, "Now you boys better go on home." He said, "If you start up here," said, "we're coming up and get you if you don't come out." And he hollered and told him, he said, "You boys better go on home, because I've got a good gun here, and if you start up here, somebody's going to get hurt." And they stopped and cursed around a minute or two and went on. And that same night, that same evening, they went on down about 5 miles southeast of here to where a man by the name of Pinion, an old preacher, lived close to the road, and they shot into that man's house. Of course, after they were here, it must have been away along toward midnight when they went by, and they shot into that man's house, and he was in bed, and he was very critically wounded. I don't know, it took him a long time to get over that gunshot. And of course you couldn't pinpoint anybody, you couldn't prosecute anybody, they didn't know for sure who it was. But
can you think of other earlier industries in the community area?
Well, there wasn't a great deal, no. Not a great deal of early industries. The oil boom started in here in 1920.
Take the period between 1900 and World War I. What can you tell about Chandler during that period?
Well, there was lots going on there. The cotton market was the main thing, and there was a few cattle sold. There wasn't very much. In fact, the country was. You can tell today that the country was very much. Cottoned. It was just, in fact, if you wanted to rent a place, you couldn't rent a farm unless you had a big bunch of children that could work it. You had to work your cotton by hand, you know, and you'd have to put nearly every bit of it in cotton. All the country land was in cotton, nearly all of it.
Can you think of any events during the early 1900s, let's say from 1900 to 1914, what would you say were highlight events, either in Chandler or that you may have witnessed elsewhere?
Well, there wasn't a great deal of, there was one or two oil operations, but they never got very deep. They didn't get deep enough to show anything, and there wasn't an awful lot of outside about anything. It was just cotton. It was largely a cotton economy. Now that's just what it was.
Yeah. Can you think of anything that happened that was of any importance, like your cyclone you mentioned in the 90s?
No, I don't know that Of course, there was a steady growth to the country. There was bridges built and roads built and things like that, and people got more conscious of the need for roads, and our schools were improved and things like that. There was just a steady growth, you know.
Were you in World War One?
No. I had a family before World War One came on. I was in 4.
Let's talk about the oil booms a little bit. When did you join? When did you tell about getting into your experience in going with this oil company, beginning with what you told me earlier about the well, about the water and how you were supplying water, and then go ahead and tell me that.
Well, in the spring of 1923, my dad had the farm here, 160 here, and he had 80 back east of here, and they were both leased. In the early 1920s, there was that was really the beginning of our oil development in this country. There was a gas well drilled out here about 2 miles southeast of us. That was a pretty productive well, and it did last for a great number of years. And it started a leasing boom. Well, he leased the place here at home and the 80 east of us. And along in the spring of 23, or the winter of 1922, some of the men that were active in leasing told him that there was going to be a well started somewhere in this immediate vicinity that next spring. So water was a problem here. There wasn't, of a dry time, there wasn't very much water, and there weren't very many farm ponds. We had one here on the home place, and I had a couple of teams and a man that worked with me. So that winter of 1922 and early in 23, 1922 I think it was, the winter of it. But it was prior to we started to work, we came over here and we built another pond dam, and another dam, and had another pond. So they came and made that location the 9th of February in 1923. And they told my dad a day or two beforehand that they were going to make that location. The Magnolia Oil Company was going to do the drilling, and they were going to make that location the 9th of September, or 9th of February. So when they came, they said they wanted him to go with us. It was an offset to the 80 he had. They wanted him to go with them, and so I made the point to be there too. And I went along, and the superintendent, E.D. Smith from Drumright, who later became vice president of Magnolia in Dallas, he was superintendent at Drumright, and he and I staked it off. We took a tape line and measured it and staked it, and when we got the location made, the stake drove the stakes for the slush pond. It was to be a cable tool well. It wasn't a rotary. And when we got through, he said, "Now, Mr. Lake," he said, where's the water going? Where are we going to get water?" I said, who's got water enough around here? He said, "It'll take lots of water." He said, "We'll have a boiler going all the time, and it'll take lots of water." And I spoke up and I said, "Well, there's water over here on about not quite a mile away." And he said, "Well, let's go look at it." And we come on over and looked at it, and he said, "Yes." He said, "I believe that," he said, "it's rained quite a bit probably this spring," and he said, "I believe we got plenty of water." And he turned to my father and he said, "Mr. Lake," he said, "we'll give you $1 a day for the use of the water." And he turned to me and he said, "We'll give you $50 a month to pump that water for us." And I said, "All right." He said, "Now all you'll have to do will be pump water," and said, "If you work at anything else for us, why, that'll be extra." I supposed it would last maybe 2 or 3 or 4 months. Those days took quite a while to drill a well. Depended on your luck that you had. If you had a fishing job or something, well, it delayed you. So they got rigged up, and I helped rig up, and I got a little extra money there. And then when they got rigged up and ready to go to work, why, we had the water pump set and the pipelines laid, and I went to pumping water. Well, we finished that well, in September, and we got it 2,600 feet deep too. That was those days. I was getting down when they hauled 4,000-foot drilling lines out. Well, that was a terrible long line, and we got that done along in September, and I supposed, of course, my job would wind up right as soon as we got it done, but the superintendent said, "Now, Jim," he said, "we like the way you work, and you're dependable, and we don't have to worry about you." He said, "We can put you out here, and if anything goes wrong, well, you call us now and tell us about it." And he said, "We like you," and he said, "We're just going to keep you on the payroll down here to look after this stuff." And I said, "That'll be fine." Well, we started another well in about a month after that, 6 weeks. And, of course, I went back to pumping water. And then the next spring, well, they started 2 more wells. By the time we got the second one, got our second one done, well, they started 2 more wells, and one of them was a rotary. And we put a water pump then down on Deep Fork, and he took me down there, and I had an engine there pumping water about almost 5 miles. I had an outfit down there, and I run it that summer, and then before those 2 wells were finished, why, the Davenport oil field came in, and Magnolia bought one of the big leases over there, what later on was a very productive bunch of leases, and they went to developing that, and they enlarged our Deep Fork water station, and I went down and worked on that, and when we got through with that, at one time we had 14 rotaries working in Davenport, and from the pumps on Deep Fork it was 10 miles through a 4-inch line, and we had 10 rotaries working over there, or 14 rotaries working over there, and they used an enormous amount of water. Well, we got by anyhow, and I went on from there, and when the Chandler field opened out west of Chandler, Magnolia drilled some out there, and I went out there on a pumping job, and I went out there the 9th of September in 27, and I retired from there the 1st of January in 57. I liked that 9 months there of being out there 30 years.
Why don't you describe a gusher coming in?
How?
Describe how a gusher coming in as you've seen.
Oh, those things were a great deal different then. They didn't have we didn't have the preventative measures, and there wasn't there wasn't the care that there is now taken. Nowadays they don't spill any oil. They go ahead and they work. You hardly know one's coming in. But we had one out west of Chandler there, right there. We called it S.D. Decker number 2, and it was right east of where the Chandler propane gas station is now. And that thing blew in when I wasn't expecting it. It wasn't ready for it, and blew in when they had the drill pipe still in the well. It was about 4,600, and it blew in and went wild. It was right by a 66 highway, and we closed that highway and had it closed all day. Detoured traffic for a mile north and a mile east, and then back south into Chandler. And that was a tremendous good well for a long time. Made lots of oil. See, those days there wasn't any proration on oil. If you could get to 1,000 barrels of oil, you could sell it. And oil.
This interview will continue on tape number 26 behind the interview of Mr. C.L. Parentage.